I'm just going to run through very short bios. And after that, I would like them to sort of actually expand on their bios and talk about themselves a little bit. So first of all, we have Neelam Heera, who's the founder of Cysters. She's named Birmingham's under 30 and she's a Pride of Birmingham winner. She's also shortlisted a Pride of Britain and a TEDx talk that she did, which we'll share on our chat later. So we're really privileged to have Neelam today. So thank you very much, Neelam. Really appreciate it. We also have Sunita Thind, who's a singer, writer, model, and a spoken word artist, a creative writer, teacher, and also a survivor of ovarian cancer, which is amazing. And we're really privileged to have her here today. She's also currently writing a memoir on British Punjabi Malaysian women living with surgical menopause, fertility loss, and surviving the cancer that I'm sure she'll talk about today. So we're really privileged to have Sunita here as well. And also we have Nikhwat Khan here, who is a mental health activist, author on social justice, and the co-founder of the award-winning mental health CIC, The Delicate Mind. He's also been featured in The Times, The Guardian, The Hungerford Post, and also the BBC, focusing on supporting racialized communities. So they're very short bios, because I could go on and speak about them for a whole hour, but we've got things to talk about today. So I thought we'd start maybe with Neelam, if you'd like to share a little bit more about herself and talk about her experience.
Yes, so firstly, thank you so much for having me here and opening this type of discussion in different areas. I always think that these discussions, because of how the nature of them, how much they're seen as taboo or heavily stigmatized in whatever way, aren't had enough and aren't had with real authenticity, because people are too scared to open up and talk about their journeys. I have been, I don't want to call myself a survivor, but I have been through a journey of low mental health and particularly self-harm. But it wasn't until my mid to late 20s that I actually felt that this is a problem and I need to get support for it. I live with 3 chronic illnesses, so one of them being PCOS, endometriosis, and PMDD. And PMDD is probably the beginning of my story, essentially. A lot of the work that I do now is centered around this type of condition because it's so underreported. And I probably think that most people listening to this probably haven't heard of PMDD. So it's called
so Neelam, explain what that is.
Yeah, so it's called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And essentially, it's the hormones around your menstrual cycle. It can, for some people, make them suicidal. And it's commonly known in the community as a very extreme form of PMS. So around the time of ovulation was always a difficult time for me. I never really linked the two, because why would you link the two? And we were never taught in sort of our education system that if you have, to note these things down or to note a pattern between menstrual cycles and low mood or even pain. So I went through many years of just dealing with that. Coupled with a few traumatic incidents that happened to me in my childhood, I kind of just bottled things up. It wasn't until my late 20s I started seeking help, but I went through a journey of really a lot of self-harm first. And it wasn't a case that I wanted to die by suicide. It was a way of me letting out frustration and typically anger. And that's an associated symptom of having premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I was misdiagnosed on a few occasions. One of the first diagnoses that actually I had when I was trying to explain my moods was actually bipolar, because the symptoms and the way they manifest themselves are very similar. But obviously it's actually because of a menstrual cycle and can't be supported by sort of antipsychotic medication. It's actually supported by like hormone, like contraceptives, etc. So if I had gone down the route of accepting that diagnosis and going on antipsychotic medication, it would never have helped me. And that's why it's so important to actually have open conversations around this, because actually you can get misdiagnosed so easily. I then went through quite a long period of quite regular self-harming, and I could never really explain why I was doing it, how I was doing it, because in the moment it was very heat at the moment. If I ever look back on it now, I can physically see myself doing it, but I could never physically stop myself. And it would be a pattern that it would just continue to manifest every month. It wasn't until I started seeking therapy generally, and that was actually initially for generalized anxiety, nothing else, that we actually unlocked. There was a lot of trauma for me to unpack generally that I had accepted as a South Asian woman, because this is how South Asian families are, this is how intergenerational families work, this is, you know, these are the things to accept as a South Asian woman. But actually through unpicking that level of trauma, I actually realized these were also feeding into why I was doing the things I was doing. I then started, you know, when I was in my mid-20s, diarizing when I was feeling low mood. And it wasn't till my therapist said, let's just record your menstrual cycles and your ovulation and thing. Now, when you've got chronic health conditions anyway, that affect your menstrual cycles, that's really hard to do because they're very sporadic or they're very long. So mine are never regular. I don't even know what they are anymore, whenever it wants to happen. And so that sort of indicated a pattern of this is a bit of a problem. But we also realized when I did have a cycle, my lowest mood would be about typically a week or two before then. So if you imagine you've got a week or two before your cycle, so you're looking at a month, a week or two before your cycle where your mood is dipping, you're feeling rage, anger, and suicidal thoughts. And then you've got a week of your actual cycle itself now having, you know, endometriosis, PCOS, it's a hard cycle anyway, and not typically a week, usually longer. You can imagine out of every month, you don't have very many good days. You've got typically a handful of good days. And that was happening every month. And it wasn't until then I started researching into it with my therapist that I actually came to the conclusion and took the evidence to the GP. However, when I was going to the GP around the things, I was coming to a completely different conclusion. So it was a real battle to get a diagnosis. And this is a condition I hadn't even heard of, even though I've been working in the space. So it's such an underreported condition. I think they say there's 1 in 20 people that suffer with it. But I believe it's underreported purely because nobody knows what it is. So that's a little bit of a background to why I ended up here. I then was lucky. I managed to get the Mirena coil, which also supports my heavy menstrual bleeding and endometriosis. But because it has localized hormones, it's actually helped me regulate my moods. So it's almost like I've got my life back, which not many people know that the Mirena coil can help them in that way. They're sort of pushed off to other drugs, or a low dosage of sort of an antidepressant can support that as well. But because it's such an underspoken about topic, we don't tend to really give any remedies for it.
Thank you, Neelam, for being so honest about such personal things. Really appreciate that. And a lot of the stuff you're saying, I wasn't aware of until I looked at your bio and started looking, researching you. I just had 2 questions. Would you mind if I ask that now?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure.
One was, how did you get to the counselling route? Was that for your GP or did you do it privately? Because I think that's a really important point to make, if you don't mind.
So if I'm honest, I went through my GP first, and I was a student at the time. So throughout this journey, as most students might know, if they live away from home, you typically live in a place for about a year and you change your doctor's GP every year to wherever you've moved to. So that was quite a difficult conversation to navigate when nobody was up to date on who you are, what's going on with you. So I was put into a referral system. I remember going for what's known as CBT. I didn't really gel with the individual. I have been very lucky in my journey. My mum's actually an EMDR therapist. So my mum actually made me go to therapy, which it didn't work the first time because physically I was made to go. And it wasn't until later on, a few months later, I actually was like, actually, I need the therapy. And then I engaged with the therapy. But before then, I wouldn't engage with the therapy at all because I was being made to go. But my mum is actually an EMDR specialist. So that's how I got it, which is very almost unheard of in our community.
Yeah.
So I think in that respect, I've been quite lucky.
Yeah, very unheard of, because South Asians, particularly women, therapy is not something that we are encouraged to or even spoken about. And I'm a different generation to you guys. You're a lot younger than me, but I say that cycle still carries on. So that's, you were very lucky, I would say. The second point I wanted to ask, with your condition, is does it affect, because I didn't quite get this in the research, does it affect South Asian people more than anyone else, or is there a correlation there? Because I couldn't quite get the research quite correct on that.
Is do you mean PMDD or generally?
PMDD.
There isn't, if I'm honest, there's not much research on PMDD. It's a really under-researched area. But generally, conditions of this nature are generally under-researched. The research then that you do have out there is typically white women, so it doesn't really reflect accurate representation of people of color anyway. But what I do know is people of color generally are more susceptible to getting cardiovascular disease and metabolic issues, which does feed into all these other reproductive health conditions as well. So genetically, we may be more likely, but the research, we don't really have much research to back that up.
Yeah, I was struggling to find anything about it. That's why I thought maybe that was an issue. Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm sure there'll be more questions later. Can I go over to you, Sunita, and would you like to?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to Neelam, and thank you for letting me know about the call as well. Yes, I really got a lot out of what you were talking about, could really relate. I actually found it a little bit hard to listen to parts of it because so I started off, my background was modelling, teaching. I'm not a primary or secondary school teacher anymore. But my journey, I would say, started off with general anxiety disorder. And when I was modelling, I would starve myself, and I would scratch myself to the point of where, I would bleed. And I thought, well, that's not self-harm. And I suffered from very low, and still do, low self-esteem, especially being in that industry where I just had to take a break. But I think it all came to a head when I was 33 and I got diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And I lost one of my ovaries, but I still was menstruating. But I think the struggle of going for scans, and I've got one next week, it's terrifying to not know if the cancer is going to come back. And I haven't had very good experiences because my husband, being English, his mother-in-law, she died from ovarian cancer. She was a surrogate mother to me. In terms of, I didn't really feel like I could speak to my family about it. And it's not unheard of, but it's very rare for women under the age of 40 to even get cancer. And I had 11 litres of fluid pumped from my belly twice. And then I had 2 cysts removed, fertility treatment. And then at the beginning of last year, it came back cancerous, and I really felt kind of almost coerced into having a hysterectomy. I didn't. But I had to have my ovary removed, my fallopian tube, my appendix. I lost my hair, all of it. I lost my periods. That's why I found it quite hard, understandably, to talk about. My fertility, ovaries, periods, hair loss. I mean, then I got surgical menopause and I gained weight. And I still find it hard to talk about because I can't have HRT. I've gone into surgical menopause. And the effects, and I got COVID during chemo and was put on a ventilator, someone's died. So that was, it's not a competition, but I'm just trying to say that I've really struggled, especially in terms of just being left with the fact, as a woman of colour, a lot of doctors, mainly white male doctors, though I did have some Asian amazing doctors, just not really understanding or getting any type of support. They just said, yeah, this is going to happen, you're going to go into the menopause. And then I was like, yeah, you can't have HRT. So again, that brings on depression, anxiety. I was already general anxiety disorder, had suffered some abuse in my childhood, and obviously I suffer from long COVID, so I have got those health issues as well. But with getting surgical menopause. You know, people would say things to me like, oh, it's just menopause, few hot flushes. No, it's not. You get panic attacks in the shower. You get depression, you get anxiety, you get weight gain. There are times where I fall on the floor, and more recently than not, I've had some bad episodes where I've been banging my head on, and I used to do it before. I would bang my head on the sink. But I found it really difficult to access any type of help. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's not something to be ashamed of either. It's not something that I really felt like I could talk to my family about. And again, the scratching until I bled. But then I thought to myself, well, that's not self-harming, because self-harming is, other things. But no, it's not. Women of colour, or especially in South Asian, in Punjabi, I can only comment on my community. We don't talk about it. Yes, my mum was keen for me to access therapy, but again, living with my grandmother, kind of from Malaysia, very pious Sikh woman, these things were not spoken about. You don't want to talk about things like that. I suffered for a long time, from identity crisis, still do, and the loss of myself and my womanhood. It's like, I can't even watch something on TV without getting really bad mood swings, in terms of, if I see someone with a period thing, or pregnant, and it's not their fault, that's just who they are. But obviously things like toxic things like, oh, you got a bit of time off, or oh, aren't you a bit old to have children now, and all those things, they really they take a toll on your mental health. And really, at the end of the day, you're learning that you have to kind of learning to kind of be your own friend, because at the end of the day, things like self-love, we're not taught those type of things. And therapy helped, CBT, I don't know, to a certain extent, but I was really struggling to find any type of therapy for my cancer. There's no help. There's really no help out there for younger women, or at all women who are going through surgical menopause. I have no idea why. You have to pay for things. And I think I just shut down. I've shut down. I stopped eating. Again, it would go back to the scratching, and the trauma, as a woman of colour, of having all these things just kind of taken away. And again, this is what Neelam said about kind of it feeds into when I go home to see my family. We don't talk about it. They never ask. And having scans coming up and feeling like your life is in danger, it's going to manifest in different ways. Like I said, anxiety, depression. When I was in so much pain, it wasn't, I wouldn't say, I think at my lowest, I really did have a point where after surgery and I'd lost my fertility, I felt like I'd lost myself, and I just thought, I don't want to be here anymore. I hate myself. What purpose do I have as a woman if I can't have a child? And I knew that I had my eggs, and I knew that I had my womb, but to me that wasn't enough. It felt like so much. And then now it's almost like, well, what's going to be taken next? I don't have the gene for it. And so I had to go out looking for the help myself. I became a media volunteer. I wrote 2 poetry books, both been accepted into the National Poetry Library. But again, it's this whole thing of not having that kind of close relationship with my mother, very kind of unemotionally unavailable, always wanting the perfectionism, looking for things, looking for approval and love in all the wrong places. And when you don't get it, well, you turn to other things, don't you? Like self-harm, like thinking, I don't want to be here, more kind of disassociative thing. I want someone else's life. Oh, why can't I be them? Internalizing a lot of self-hate. And as a woman of colour, not that I'm saying that as a man of colour, it's not difficult, but I think women have a lot of things put on them, like having to be, the perfect wife, the perfect role model. Aren't you going to have an arranged marriage? Why are you marrying a white man? Even though I'm from a background where part of my family are mixed race, mixed heritage. So yeah, there's a lot of things there, but I have found I had to claw myself out of it, and I actively went and through creative writing and lots of other things, becoming a media volunteer, because a lot of the stories out there, there are few and far between of women of colour Again, like you said, I guess a lot of the research and things are for women who are Caucasian, or people who are white middle class. I didn't want to believe it to begin with, and there's nothing against them, but there needs to be more done. There needs to be more support out there, definitely, and we don't talk about it. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, definitely. So yeah, just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunita. I don't really know where to start. I've made some notes, but thank you so much for coming today, because I'm sure it's not easy. It's not easy to listen about Neelam's experience, and you've shared so much there. And I really, really do appreciate that. I can't say that enough. And you're very brave to come and talk about these things, because, as you say, South Asian women in particular, we don't get the support, and we don't talk about things, we hide things. And if you can't get some of that support from your family, it makes everything 1,000 times harder. And I really, really appreciate what you said, and to be so open. I do have a question for you. I hope that's okay.
Of course.
I'm quite interested where you said that scratching you didn't feel it was self-harm. So do you mind sort of just, when did that scratching start? Because from what you said, that was kind of the beginning.
For me, I would say the scratching started probably when I was 15. It probably just was when I started modelling, because I was looking for approval in different places. I was like, well, if I'm not getting love from here, then maybe I can get it from other people and other places, or boyfriends or whatever else. So I would go into the bathroom and I would scratch until I bled, and I would hide it. And I think maybe because it was on the media, it was kind of like you saw women mostly of colour, not of colour, on TV, and the self-harm thing would be, cutting or this and that. And I was like, oh, I'm not self-harming, because I think it was a form of denial. Scratching isn't self-harm. And it was only when I met my husband, and he was kind of like, this is a form of self-harm. You're starving yourself. And what I'm saying is that, yeah, I didn't see it as, because again, it's that kind of stereotypical image of, oh, it's cutting, it's this, and I'm not discrediting that. That is, I have a cousin who has gone through that, and she has not spoken about it. She told me, and I was very shocked, because I did not think that was a form of self-harm. But scratching until you bleed on the sides of your arms, where I've got scars and things, and I use BioWall to cover up. But when I look at that, I feel really sad, because I'm like, did I not love myself enough? If you're not taught to love yourself, if you're not taught how to manage these really difficult emotions, and you don't know where to go, and your family are like, what, you're going to get therapy? What for? You feel like you have to be so secretive all the time, as a woman anyway, don't wear makeup, don't do this, don't do that, wear a high neck top, all these things that women have to do to fit in to that mold of being the perfect South Asian woman and everything else. This wasn't part of it. So why would I tell my family? Why would I tell anyone about it? And I'm being completely honest that when this thing came up, I didn't feel comfortable enough to share it on Instagram. I liked it and I shared it on my Twitter. And then I found out my mum was following me on Instagram. There was no way I could have a conversation even now about this with her. Which is sad. I have other members in my family that perhaps I can talk to, but it's not the same thing. It's really my husband and my dog who are the main ones that are there for me. And she didn't want me to say anything about my illness anyway. And I was just like, no, my it's my life, it's my choice. I'm being very careful with my memoir to not mention anyone in my family, because again, you don't want to disrespect. But yeah, I'd definitely say that I didn't think it was any type of didn't think it was an issue, so didn't seek help.
No, yeah. I totally understand that, and I would say that I did find some research on self-harm, and it's not all about cutting. There's scratching your hair, pulling your hair out, there's starving yourself. There's so many different angles, and in one of the research I read, I'm sorry I didn't make a note of it, they said that South Asian women are more likely to self-harm. It's one of the highest things, but how many people, and you can understand why, because if we're not encouraged to talk about anything and not encouraged to love ourselves and don't get as much praise as generally, then what else are these women going to do? But it's one of the highest issues is self-harm. for South Asian women, which is very scary. And it's great that we're talking about these issues today. And thank you very much again, Sunita. I really appreciate it. And do take care of yourself after this.
I will do.
Make sure you do something nice with your husband, and maybe pat the dog or take him out for a walk.
I will say
that at the end to all of us, but I feel I need to say it now. So I'm just going to move on because I know we're already running late, which usually happens to me. So I'm going to speak to Nikhwat, and I hope I got your name right. Great. Would you like to just talk a little bit about your journey and your experiences? And thank you very much for coming and being the only male. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. And as obviously I mentioned beforehand, I was quite conscious of coming into a space where I didn't want to speak over this, because just to echo a lot of what Sunita and Neelam said, I completely agree with everything I hear and I see and I understand within our communities, and not necessarily just within the South Asian diaspora, but across wider Western society. There is a level of socialization that men and women and people outside of that binary experience and have to fit into. And obviously that brings within it its own challenges, a lot of challenges that tend to come up. So it was quite humbling actually to be able to hear them from Sunita's and Neelam's perspective. So again, thank you for having me in this space. So with regards to myself, my experience is more so in relation to suicide and mental health. So I myself am someone who lives with depression. I'm 28 years old now, and I've lived with it since I've been, I want to say 14. It was then I started to exhibit and see the signs of what was, at the time I didn't know was depression, but as you begin to educate and understand more about your reality and the totality of who you are, I began to understand that it was depression that I was struggling with and that I was living with. So a few years ago, in fact, in 2017, God rest his soul, my younger brother died as a consequence of suicide. And during that time, I was going through a lot of difficulty, a lot of pain. And whenever anything, and I hope and I think, and I believe at least, from a little bit from what Neelam and Sunita have said, and also something which is a life lesson of mine, is quite often things will happen to all of us in our lives that we have no control over. And so there's something called an internal locus of control and an external locus of control, meaning that factors will happen outside of your creation, such as coronavirus, in which you have no real control over, and you can only choose how you respond towards this, which is your internal locus. And I'd always been involved in a lot of mental health work, a lot of charity, a lot of activism. I was grown up and I was taught that as someone who's South Asian living in a Western country, you have to work twice as hard to get to a point in which you want to, which I know is something that a lot of children of the diaspora understand and experience. So I was always involved in different kinds of things, putting my jack of all trades but master of none is effectively why I was there. And so what happened was I was involved with a program a few years ago through an organization called the Faith and Belief Forum, which brings together students from different universities to create a social action project and then be mentored by a member of parliament. And because this is recorded, I'm very conscious of saying who the member of parliament was, because she is well known and she was never, ever, ever there to actually mentor us. And I'm not here to try and catch a case, to be honest with you. So more importantly, and less funnily, what happened was we did this event. We ran a couple of workshops within university, which was based on student wellbeing, which went and received extremely well. And I then became an alumni of that network and of that platform. And around that time was when Shahab, God rest his soul, passed away. And I remember just going through all kinds of experiences and all sorts of things at the time. As it's been touched upon, self-harm is different. It doesn't necessarily just have to be a level of physicality you put on towards yourself. It can be your habits. I took up smoking and I was smoking really badly. My, should I say, my promiscuous habits really exacerbated a lot as well. And I recognized that was me putting a lot of self-harm on towards myself, projecting and putting things out onto other persons and other people. And it took me a while to bring myself back into myself, into who I am and how I experience myself and who I believe myself to be. And so I had received an email from Parliamentals, the Faith and Belief Forum, to say that we have a little pot of funding available for people to create some kind of workshop, which is to do something that you guys want to do some sort of social action work. And I remember looking at this again and again, thinking there's something here. And then I just came off the Beep Station Network to speak about mental health in South Asian communities and my experience. And my best friend came to visit me. He only lives around the corner. And he said, Nikhwat, I need to speak to you about something. And I was like, okay, what is it? And he said, you know, all this work that you do with mental health? And I said, yeah. He said, we should target it at Muslims. And I swore out of excitement, and because I was so like taken by the idea. So there and then we wrote this application out together just to apply for the part of funding, and we were successful. And so we began about creating a workshop for initially for just Muslim communities within London. And what happened as we began to create this workshop is we found that there was a lot of interest from different people, from different faith backgrounds, different genders, sexualities, and we thought, okay, this is interesting, something here. So we responded accordingly. We set up a series of activities, and we had it as an interfaith base to have interfaith dialogue. So we did one workshop, which was really, really well received. And then another one because that was asked for, and another one because that was also asked for as well. And since then, by the grace of God, by a lot of hard work and also luck with all of the Holy Trinity, so to speak, we've managed to really build ourselves into a fully functioning organization. So the Delicate Mind, which is the organization's name, is now an award-winning community interest company. We work across different sectors. So we've worked with public health bodies, we've worked with prisons, we've worked with youth organizations, faith institutions, research bodies, schools, community groups. And the essence of what we do now is we focus on supporting racialized and working class communities, because these are two experiences that I know quite well. Through that, we do a couple of things. So we do research. So currently at the moment, we have 2 research projects that have been funded that we are creating. One of them is on the basis of universal basic income. Another one is about re-examining drug policy, specifically cannabis legalization, because young Black ethnic minority men and women and people are disproportionately criminalized as a consequence of the current drug system. And we recognize that by taking that apart, there's a lot that we can do to support people's mental health, the economy, and also society as well. Obviously, a lot of these problems that we are concerned about only exist because of the structures of the society in which we operate and we exist under. So a lot of that for us is more about, even though it's very important to have conversations about mental health and mental health awareness, which is so important, and that dial is still shifting and still taking a lot of time, we should look more intricately at what are the structures and factors which cause these things to happen. Again, a lot of them are responses to the society in which we exist in. So we're doing a couple of research projects. We do general workshops and mental health strength and mental health training for different organizations, as I said, such as faith institutions, research bodies, so on and so forth. One of them that we're going to be running with is a fantastic organization, which I would really signpost everybody here to, called Suicide & Co., which supports people who've been bereaved as a consequence of suicide. So a lot of that is forgotten about, that obviously people like myself who have experienced bereavements through suicide, the support that we need afterwards is a lot. And obviously trauma is different for every individual, every individual person. Everybody needs specific kind of support. But I really, those guys are very close to my heart, so I'd really recommend, if anyone's experienced or been affected by suicide, please do check out Suicide & Co. So we do that, and we've also just done all kinds of different stuff. To be honest with you, it's been a real journey, to be honest with you. I've met people like that I never thought I would have met. I've had experiences I never thought that would happen. Things that I've actually prayed for, to be quite honest with you, actually came true, which is the best way to mess with your mind, to be honest with you. When you pray for something and it happens in your reality, it's a lot to take in. And quite recently, we've been funded by Public Health England and by Public Health Birmingham to run a bereavement service for Muslims across the West Midlands. So this is a service which will be looking at self-identifying men, self-identifying women, and also people from a mixed group as well, to come together in a peer-to-peer support group. So it begins from January till next May, in which we will have a service in which men will be able to sit down with self-identifying men, have a peer-to-peer support network. And then the second part of that session, which is very important, and I think is something similar to what you guys are doing today, is creating something which is more culturally competent support. So for me, I'm someone who is of spiritual persuasion, in the sense that I think there's something more metaphysical. But I also understand that, coming from my community, that a lot of the time it's almost like there's one or the other. It cannot be a combination in between. But in actuality, I found through my experiences, my spiritual experiences, I feel a lot more closer towards science and the empirical understanding of the world, because coming from a Muslim background, the golden age of Islam was one of the areas in which there was a lot of focus on algebra, science, mathematics. And one of my favorite facts I always like sharing is the theory of evolution was actually created by a man called Al-Jahiz, who was a black Muslim man 100 years prior towards Charles Darwin, who wrote something called the Kitab al-Hayun, which translates to the Book of Animals, in which he observed there was an evolutionary method that animals have prior towards Charles Darwin 100 years ago. But who am I to talk about history in its revisionist ways, right? So for us, I think it's very important that we intermarry both of them for people to have a much more, I suppose, nuanced understanding of how these things come into form and how they affect us as individuals and people. So this is something that we're doing at the moment. I would really love for you to have a look at the website. We've managed to achieve a lot of stuff. On our front line, we managed to have supported 4,000 people. We estimated to be a little bit more, but it's always important to have a conservative estimate as opposed to an overestimate as well. And yeah, things are going really well. It's been very, very peculiar to be on this journey. It's something that I'm really grateful for. And someone brought something up to me, actually, I'll end on this, in which they talked about trauma growth or something, which I didn't understand until recently this year, which is what tends to happen is when someone goes through something quite traumatic or very difficult, there tends to be a basis of internal growth or self-development, which brings you onto some other kind of level. It's still a concept that I'm still understanding, to be honest with you, but it's something that I know, that I've experienced, that I've felt and I feel. And again, I'm very grateful to be in this space with all of you to be discussing these issues because they're very important. And thank you so much for having me and listening to my spiel, which I think was okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're all going to need something to relax after this. But I would say that I really appreciate your honesty and your vulnerability about your brother, because that's not easy to talk about. And I don't want to upset you in any way.
No, it's okay. You can ask me anything that you need to. This is what I do. I
would say that, well, what I'm thinking is that if that didn't happen to your brother, your life, would your life still, I'm not being very articulate,
no,
but is that your journey? That's part of your journey because of your brother? And that's why, because from coming from a Muslim background, suicide is something we as Muslims, we never 100%. Say that word.
100%.
I actually find it not uncomfortable. I've learned a little bit about it recently, but it's a word that I've never heard in public from a Muslim.
Absolutely, no, 100%. And just to touch on a story, God rest his soul when he passed away, and there's so much miscommunication, misunderstanding. And I think in one sense it's become a bit of like a personal mission for me to really take that apart for people to comprehend what suicide actually is. It is such a difficult loss to go through. Anyone's experienced it will be able to tell you from their heart to yours. It's very peculiar, it's very strange, especially when it seems almost quite instantaneous. But it is a massive issue, not just necessarily within South Asian communities, but I think across society, because when that word is said to people, I've noticed through my experiences, whenever I've mentioned it, there's always a level of almost uncomfortability from people. They'll always respond to say, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I understand it's genuine and sincere. And I always I take it from my heart. But I've noticed, and remember this has happened to me now for almost, oh gosh, it's been 4 years now. And there's always this look that people give to me. It's almost slightly vacant. They don't really know what to say in response. And there's no malice from my heart to theirs, but I can kind of comprehend that it's very difficult for them to understand, to see. And again, to touch back on our community 100%, when, he passed away, God rest his soul, those the typical aunties, and a lot of us will be quite familiar with them from the South Asian diaspora, what an auntie is. Not necessarily one of my arch nemesis, but that's a whole other conversation for a whole other time. So obviously he passed away, and then one woman went to my mom and said to her, and this isn't how he passed away, but she said to him, I heard that your son jumped in front of a train. Was it Pagal? Pagal obviously being the word for crazy. And this is something, when I heard about, I was furious, to be quite honest with you. But nonetheless, within our community, that word is so loaded. There's so much connotations on a religious and a cultural perspective that it's very difficult for us to take apart. And I don't think that if he had passed away that I'd be on this journey. I don't think I'd be where I am. I really believe truly in my heart and my soul. I can see myself now, actually, when this happened, that I made that decision. I remember someone telling me at that time, you have to put purpose to your pain. And something like that has really stayed with me since then. And through these experiences, as I've said, I've managed to work with people from all these different backgrounds, have quite honestly revolutionary, transformative experiences in my own sense of self. And then to be able to work in this kind of capacity through these experiences wouldn't have happened to me. I would probably still be a chubby stoner within my room with no real sense of direction. But obviously that's not what I was meant to be doing or where I am. And this is the journey that I walk and something that I am grateful for.
Thank you. Thank you for being so honest about that. I just felt it was a question that I needed to ask, and I don't know if anybody wanted to know that. We're going to stop the recording.
Ba-da-bum-bum-bum.